Let me do the formal introductions once for the panel here. And this panel justifies the topic being infrastructure, the new silver bullet. And I have with me Faisal Ashraf, the Managing Director for Mitsui and Company India, Alok Kumar, Chairman, President and CEO of NEC Corporation in India, Bharat Joshi, Chairman of Joshi Konike Transport and Infrastructure Private Limited, and Mangal Dev, the head for Hitachi Rail Systems in India and South Asia, as well as a director at Hitachi India. Very warm welcome to all of you here. The subject, infrastructure, a silver bullet. Infrastructure is something that India needs, and we have been on a pretty decent journey, and that journey will not stop, at least not in the near future. And infrastructure for the companies that make these wonderful technologies and the products that help us build our infrastructure, and infrastructure for the common person means two different things really. For the common man, it would manifest in better airports, better railways, better roads, highways, less traffic jams, cleaner air, water in the context of India, power, availability of power which is uninterrupted and of good quality. And these are the companies that really make it happen. And what I'm going to do in the half an hour or so that we have for this session is to get all the four panelists to make quick opening remarks, like maybe just 1.5 minutes, to set up what they would like to talk about. And I will start with Faisal on my immediate left for his opening remarks. Faisal, over to you.
Thank you, Siddharth. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting us here. So very quick response. I think you referred to infrastructure manifested in the common man's engagement. And there is no doubt that there has been very significant improvement, development over the last decade from a common person's perspective. But from a perspective of where India is on its infrastructure life cycle, on its infrastructure journey, I think we are not even 1/3 of the way there. So how do we navigate the next 10 years? I know in infrastructure we think in terms of 20, 30, 40 years, especially the Japanese infrastructure community will take a very long-term perspective. And I'm really keen to hear the views, yourself, Siddharth, and the other members as to how do we do this. But just to conclude my 1.5 minutes very quickly, your title is the silver bullet, right? And I looked up what it means, and it means a simple, magical solution to a complex, intractable problem.
Okay.
Right? And my only submission is that I don't think there is a silver bullet.
There's no magic, really.
There's no magic wand. I think we have to put our nose to the grindstone and just keep on executing till that number happens.
That's a wonderful point. And he said something that we should all take note of. We are 1/3 of the way, and I'm going to come back to him on that. Mangal, I'm coming to you. Should the session have really, instead of saying silver bullet, said the bullet train, the solution to all of India's infrastructure problems? Go ahead, Mangal.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me into this very prestigious panel to discuss on the infrastructure. And I'll very quickly jump into, as you talked about, India needs not only the metros, where Delhi Metro became the pioneer in setting every city in motion to have metro systems of heavy, medium, and light capacity, but also is important that in addition to the main line, we see some very important and prestigious projects of high speed, crisscrossing the country, starting from Mumbai to Ahmedabad, which itself is very, very challenging. But I think it's the need of the hour for India to, take itself to the next level in terms of the mission and the vision of the country to be a 5 trillion economy. And therefore, railway is going to play a very, very crucial role. And today what I see is, one of my comments is that, India needs to bridge infrastructural gap, in a big way, and that is one of the key driver of economy to 5 trillion US dollar by, very, very soon than later.
That's a good point, bridging the gap. And with him, again, I would like to contest this. Is it just about bridging the gap or creating infrastructure that will survive for 25 years? Faisal was talking about the Delhi airport and Jewar example. I'll come back to you on that. Alok, I'll come to you last because I want to get Bharat in on this. And Bharat, a lot of people have spoken about the bullet train and have spoken about the cost and saying that, you need to get your priorities right. But isn't the bullet train an example of great technology transfer? And if you set that as the sort of guiding beacon, you will get and do other projects equally quickly. And with that, your opening remarks, really.
Thank you. Look, I couldn't agree more, but it's more than merely that. The External Affairs Minister earlier this morning alluded to two things. The first was a discussion or even a debate on the first, metro project in this country, the Delhi Metro, which was built with JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency funding. And this was precisely the kind of debate which was in some ways, sort of facile, are we too poor for this, are we ready for this and whatnot. And the finest examples of infrastructure in this country have happened, of course, with Japan and within transport infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And what we've seen with the metro is that once it was demonstrated to be useful and to be seminal in the way urbanization developed in this country, it expanded outwards. Now, virtually every state capital has their own metro coming up. The second quick example is of JBIC, Japan Bank of International Cooperation, which was one of the founding and funding partners of what was at the time called DMIC, Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. And that was such a fabulous success at scale that now it's called the National
Infrastructure Fund.
Yes, so National Infrastructure Development. So it's not just DMIC, there's several corridors. So what we find is that the Japanese are able to demonstrate that, hey, this is possible in India, and then we expand it outwards.
Absolutely. So while there may be alphabet soup, let that not take away from what has really been done. And I want to tell you, I would request everyone in the audience to think for themselves, what was the first example in terms of infrastructure, both physical or soft infrastructure, that they experienced, which was built in cooperation with the Japanese. For me, I'll start that by saying a bridge connecting what used to be called Jamuna Par, Delhi, and what is now called Lutyens, Delhi. That's many, many years back. And if you would drive a bike, those days you would start from home with a white shirt, and by the time you reached wherever, you would reach with a black and white shirt. The front was black, the white was still at the back. Alok, the collaboration point that Bharat spoke about, would I be right in getting you to reflect on this on your opening remarks, that more than 3 decades, Japan has proven to be an all-weather friend when it comes to infrastructure in India?
Absolutely. And I think, the minister opened the morning on some similarities of India and Japan. I just want to pause for a moment and all of us to reflect upon this. India is a society that is in a hurry. We are a generation that is in a hurry. We want to get there faster than anybody else has been there on this planet. And where I'm getting with that point is that, therefore, it's no surprise that we as a country are at the same point of nation building today that Japan found itself 40 to 50 years back. And there is a huge amount of learning that we can draw from how Japan built its country and what is needed in India. So I just want to broaden the aperture a little bit to say that infrastructure just doesn't mean putting rail tracks and making bridges and making airports. It's also about how do we improve the user experience, so that the amount of time that an average individual spends in getting by, for example, from a place A to B, improves. Getting through airport, it's a nightmare in India. Can we automate it? Can we make it faster? Can we make it simpler? Can we make it easier for a common man? And this is where we as a company, as a corporation, needs to really invest our energies around. And I think Japan has a humongous amount of learning to bring back to India.
Absolutely. And It's not just funding, it's about the process and the way things are done. When I was studying for a business degree, one of my first industrial visits was to the Maruti Suzuki plant, and I got to see processes which helped me write a case study which got me good marks. Faisal, but coming back to the one third done, what is left to be done still?
Well, let me try and simplify it for my mind, because this is a huge topic. And I don't want to go into numbers and statistics at this point in time, but broadly speaking, especially if you look at it from a per capita consumption perspective, per capita consumption of infrastructure, we have perhaps reached 1/3 of the infrastructure life cycle over the last 100 years. It's taken us about 100 years, maybe a bit more, to reach this 1/3. And I don't think, I think there's a fair amount of consensus that the next 1/3 will probably take the next 10 or 20 years. And this, for me, is very critical. And the reason why it's critical, and I just wanted to...
Why do you say, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you here. Why do you say that it will take far lesser time?
For the simple reason that we are now a society which is looking for outcomes, which is looking for delivery. The last 100 years, there's been massive tectonic political, physical changes. So obviously, you know, the initial infrastructure development, the railways were started by the English who were here. So obviously things moved at a different pace. Industrial revolution was taking.
Right.
Now everything, all these technologies are in place. They can be deployed. The template on which they are deployed is standardized. There are fantastic examples of, this panel was discussing about the Noida Bridge is what you talked about. The Delhi Metro was a reference that Dr. Jaishankar talked about. All this has already happened. So the template for delivery is available, and therefore the speed at which the next 1/3 will happen, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in this to say whether it'll happen in the next 10 or 20 years, but if I have to take a position off the top of my head, I see the next 1/3 happening over the next 20 years.
Okay, great. Next 20 years, that's a great point, and it tells you what Faisal said really about how ambition and capability is going together. Bharat, I want to come to you on this point, something that Nitin Gadkari, the Minister for Road Transport and Highways, keeps saying in our events, in interviews to me. He always says, "Paise ka sawal mat pucho. Don't ask me about money. There is no dearth of money. It is about execution capacity." And what Faisal said, would you agree with him that in terms of execution and delivery, we are now at a point where we can aspire to do it far faster?
Yes, I mean, in a word, yes. I'd agree with both, with Faisal San as well as the Honorable Minister, because the execution capacity has just gone through the roof, and the kind of projects that we are delivering in this country, both in the government sector as well as the private sector, is, you know, tremendous. I mean, it's easy to forget, you know, the amount of cynicism that accompanied any announcement or any project till very recently. And now, you know, the proof is very much felt, you know, in the delivery of these projects. So that's one. The second is, and again, I will, you know, allude to what the External Affairs Minister said earlier this morning from this very dais, about how, you know, we see the big projects or the big names in terms of, you know, the Sogo Soshas or the big Japanese corporations, but they're backed by almost a family, a kairetsu of SMEs who very ably, you know, are able to enable an intricate web and a network of value chain behind them. So I think in some ways, you know, that is now happening, that's maturing. And I think just, you know, again, deriving from Faisal San's point, that is part of what will accelerate the change. And the other half, and this is now a little bit Alok San's subject, of this phenomenon of tech acceleration, how technology and digitalization accelerates everything. So whatever we've seen in the past will happen at a much more furious pace going forward.
Mangal, may I come to you not just on the railways, but newer areas of cooperation that you might see manifesting, especially in the drive towards a low carbon future. I don't imagine it being zero carbon for a country like ours, but at least low carbon.
Thank you. So I think the impetus is rightly so in the climate and environment, and in Hitachi, of course, we are aligning towards doing innovation and implementing these kind of strategies in together with the Government of India and also the private sector. In railways and otherwise also, we see railways have taken a phenomenal step to move from diesel traction to electric traction. And this conversion or electrification has been done on a very war footing basis. We have completed almost 80 to 90% of electrification in a very short time. And what it has led to is a lot of energy saving, that you can feed back. So when you run an electric train on an electrified network, you are not burning the energy during braking system, but you are feeding this back into the system. So this hugely adds to saving energy and using energy back into. Therefore, this is the biggest and the largest step. The second is the new technology. We have moved from. Now I'm going to be a little more technical. The IGBT system, the semiconductors, which are playing a big role in becoming energy efficient in managing the energy that is being utilized on trains or on the electric vehicles that we will see very soon. So the technology moving into IGBTs and then the silicon carbide technologies, which are much more efficient. Of course, the pressure on semiconductor manufacturing will become very, very important. And how do we manage that? And the Government of India is rightly investing into creating capacity for that. From the design, innovation, and manufacturing. So not only in the railway sector, but also I see that in the water management, in making sure that the operational and maintenance of the entire piped network system in any Delhi for water, or even managing the sewage, where we can reuse and recycle the water and keep our rivers clean. I think there is a lot of impetus in bringing the digital technologies in solving the climate issues.
Right.
So these are some of the areas which I can highlight at the moment.
Alok, I'm coming to you, and whenever we talk about infrastructure in a very generalized sense, it's mostly physical infrastructure that's spoken about. I don't know how many people in the audience are aware that around 2 years back, we managed to connect the Indian mainland to Andamans. And the company that did the fiber optic cable, Alok, is NEC. And it's not just about road connectivity, it's also about digital connectivity. On that, what I want you to tell our audience is how difficult is execution. Faisal spoke about how things are getting faster when it comes to the overall thing, but in terms of the execution part of the challenge, what would you say?
Well, a short answer to this is it's really difficult. And
it is really difficult?
It is really difficult to execute in India. And I don't, I'm trying to be brutally honest over here, because if we are not staring at the mirror, we'll not find a solution. I think India is a very complex polity. There is federal government, there is state government. Our infrastructure the word infrastructure that we call, has many subjects in it. Some of these subjects are central subjects, and some of these are state subjects. And for a Japanese company, or for that matter, for any company, even for an SME, the rules of the game is different at different levels. And if the rules keeps changing, an organization needs to be that much more nimble, that much more resilient to be able to successfully execute projects that are centrally funded, centrally governed, and state-funded, state-governed. The big point I'm trying to make is that while at a G2G level, at a government-to-government level, there is a very, very strong understanding between India and Japan, and how Japan wants to support India, I think we need to do more work in permeating that understanding and that sense of urgency down into the front line of the country where all the execution happens. And a part of this is not intention. So I don't want the audience to be confused that I'm alluding to the intention is not there. The intention is always there. But I hold a principle which says while growth can be described by many formulas, my pet formula is growth is equal to intention times ability.
Okay.
So while you may have a lot of intention to do things, if you don't have the ability to do it, you're not going to go too far. And I think the challenge in execution in India is that we need to build ability at the ground level. Ability of project governance, ability of institutions that are responsible for making sure that those projects gets executed. It's not about funding anymore. I 100% agree with Mr. Gadkari that it's not about funds. India today can attract as much fund as it can, but it needs to get invested, executed properly. And I think the government and the private sector need to think collaboratively and cooperatively as to what is the ecosystem we build, where projects that can get funded irrespective of wherever from gets executed with a certain sense of urgency. And I think that is the biggest challenge that we have as a country.
Faisal, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I mean, there's nobody's case to not agree. And the execution of mega projects is a challenge. The complexity, the regulatory complexity in terms of the central government, the state government, and the operating level bodies on the ground is not going to go away. I think we, as players in the infrastructure space, will have to develop playbooks to be able to execute here. But having said that, are there ways in which the difficulty can be kind of mitigated by a kind of a public-private partnership template? So, I agree with that. Again, there is no silver bullet for it. We have to sort of get down, engage, put our nose to the grindstone and execute. But I just wanted to allude, if you could just give me a moment more, to another point that was talked about, and that was consumer expectations, and what can be done perhaps with, if I may call it, a low-hanging fruit. And I think one of the themes of this discussion was railways. And I believe the Indian Railways knows this, but the Indian Railways, insofar as the consumer interface is concerned, is sitting on huge value in the form of what it can do at the railway stations and the land banks that are there. I think it's a low-hanging fruit relatively. And the reason why I say this is because the capability of Japanese companies, or the capability of the Japanese development over the last 5 decades, it can bring tremendous amount of value here, whether it's consumer-centric businesses, retail, massively improving the consumer experience, and in that process create new value, provide new employment. I think that's a low-hanging fruit relative to the hard infrastructure development. And I guess we need to focus on these low-hanging fruits.
That's an important point. I'm reminded of someone who's not here, who actually runs a school which trains people in the Japanese language to be able to work with all the Japanese companies in India. I'm coming to you, Bharat, and the question that I really have is, digressing from just talking about pure infrastructure, how much of a cultural fit do you see enabling the India-Japanese partnership and cooperation that we have seen over the last so many years?
So we are in a very fortunate position to work as joint venture partners with Japanese companies, and we also have a very cordial relationship and a working relationship both with Mitsui-san and NEC-san for many years. So Mangalji, maybe you should consider something. Beyond the veneer of a huge amount of incongruity almost, there is a huge bedrock and a huge depth of shared values, shared fundamentals. The really important stuff that matters to people is just so intuitively there between
Give us a few examples if you can.
the way we think about hierarchy, the way we think about, the things that really matter in a personal sense, the way we look at, honoring ancestors. I mean, it sounds very superfluous, but actually, all of these things percolate to how we behave out in society, out at work, and so on. But look, there are also dissimilarities, which actually, to my mind, are excellent. Because, when you're partnering with somebody, what you're looking for is a fit. They should ideally bring some strengths which you lack, right? And you should perhaps also be able to offer strengths that they could do with. So, I mean, look, all the brands which are here, on the dais and, the sponsors and so on, are examples of hugely successful Japanese or Indo-Japanese companies. So Maruti Suzuki, is it a Japanese company? Is it an Indian company? I would argue both equally. And I think that is the ideal marriage of the Japanese way of working in a very methodical and precise fashion with the Indian ability to navigate the dynamic, volatile, uncertain, rapidly shifting landscape. And look, what a fabulous world-beating product and a brand they've come out with. So culturally, it takes work, but I think there's still enough in there to not... I think people get frightened away without understanding necessarily how well it can come together. But look, I'm hardly the person because everybody else here has so much more experience, and Faisal-san himself has lived in Japan, so so he could perhaps speak for an hour on this alone. Thanks.
Yeah. Mangal, I'm coming to you. It's easy for a lot of people to connect with US companies, big brands, consumer, lifestyle, media, social media. But not a lot of people would connect with Japanese brands because you are ultimately industrial powerhouses and may not really be, you're not in telecom when it comes to users, for just as an example. Given the long sustained relationship and the investments that we have seen, what kind of money do you see the Indian infrastructure ecosystem being able to absorb over the next 10, 20 years from Japan for a variety of infrastructure? I'm not confining it to only one kind.
So when we look back, I think one of the biggest sector which has absorbed a great amount of ODA fund, India being the largest recipient of the ODA finance, and one of the biggest sector that has gained, hugely is the metro rail. And, this example is, very well executed because Delhi set a template not only in the governance, a 50-50 joint venture between the state and the center, which takes care of the central policy and the state policy. We typically have these issues, state subject and center subject. I think that is phenomenal, and this is growing. So there is no stoppage to this kind of momentum. The second is this high speed has created a new template. I see, I have seen the metro, now I see the high speed, and I think this could propel India to follow the Maruti Suzuki model, because this is going to bring a huge technology transfer, the way we plan projects, the way we look at risk and challenges, both in terms of cost and time. Because in the Japanese system, what is very important is that let's spend more time understanding the ground situation and have a proper planning, maybe do some pre-design work and just, keep the last amount of time to implement on the ground. Whereas, so if we make this phenomenal shift towards that, I think we heard that, what is missing, what is the difference between the two cultures? I think this is, for me, this is one of the biggest gap that exists, and I think we are making progress, because this not only needs patience and also a kind of belief that we can deliver the project in the given time.
Right.
We jump to start the project on the ground before having done
the preparatory work.
Preparatory work.
One quick follow-up on that example you gave, and you spoke about Maruti Suzuki as well as the metro success. Explain to our audience, because not everyone will understand just the term technology transfer. Maruti Suzuki, among so many other side benefits, led to the development of an auto ecosystem, SMEs. No one knew those companies. The company that manufactures the windows and the glass shields for the car. There was no company doing that in India. What will the bullet train ecosystem lead to in your view?
So when we talk about bullet train, you know, when it was conceived, so there was a huge requirement that we should use Japanese companies to do the civil construction. Now, you know, after renewed approach and, you know, much more detailed analysis and looking at the credentials of the Indian companies executing the civil work, I think a large number of civil companies have benefited. So we have now a set of large companies and medium and small companies participating in the execution of the civil work. So
but won't someone say civil is just the basic work, anyone can do it? What about high technology?
Civil is the most important. It is the foundation. It is the foundation on which the entire system will stand. So maybe it, you know, when we look at a building, maybe, you know, even the buildings are becoming very high tech. But railway, one of the most strongest foundation is the civil. Because what you see on the ground, there is enormous inside the ground. And when you have to, you know, look at high speed, you know, a train, a system running at 300 plus kilometers per hour, the system has to create a stable, you know, both in terms of vibrations and harshness and noise, you know, that it can add to the ambience
and you can't have animals crossing the track.
Yeah, so even for the crossings, I mean, it is very well conceived that from, it's an elevated viaduct. And therefore, you know, there are a number of opportunities for them to cross over. So what it's going to add to is this. The second is the operation and maintenance is a huge subject, you know, in the railway. What Suzuki saw creating distributors and the maintenance in every city, every town, everywhere. So the equivalent of that is the operation and maintenance of the civil or the electrical or the systems and as well as the trains. So the whole training and transfer of technology will happen by which we are going to, you know, augment a complete skill set to be able to manage these high-tech trains. So this is a great example of transfer, and by this it would mean that we can then start to manufacture those components in India. Maybe not in the very beginning, because we need to maintain certain level of sanctity, you know, that we can execute the project in time. But when we get into the operation maintenance and the railway system goes up to 40 years, you know, the trains can have a mid-life of 20, 25 years, and then refurbish for another 20 years. So this is going to create a huge supply chain of the spare parts in every area that the railway will take.
I'm glad you gave us that extended reply because it was important to understand. Faisal, you wanted to come in?
I couldn't agree more with Mangal. I work for a company which is involved directly, even as we speak, in civil projects with a dedicated freight corridor, and laying the foundation, including constraints in land acquisition, etc., are big delay factors. And I think we should focus on the civil, because the electrical, the tech that sits on the civil is relatively available, relatively easy to do after the foundation is laid. So I agree with that completely. But if I can, you know, if I can come in, kind of converge or fold in a lot of conversations that the other panelists have talked about.
Yep.
I think one of the key factors in terms of how Japan operates in India with Indian companies and how Indian companies operate with Japan, on a lighter note, and I'll apologize to some of my Japanese colleagues here who may not get this reference, but there are two games happening here. There is a Test cricket going on and there is T20 going on, and it's going to continue. And the worst thing that we can do is to bring a T20 game to a Test match or a Test game to a T20 match. And we have done that. So I think the real partnership is to bring the best of Japan, bring the best of agile Indian global practices, and kind of combine that into a unified delivery. And I think that is where huge potential remains to be garnered and put on the ground.
Bharat, on that same note of the future, looking at it in a positive sense.
I think in some ways we've barely scratched the surface. Prime Minister Kishida just earlier this year doubled right away the amount of investment that would occur over the last 5 years in India. It's some 5 trillion yen over this duration. So that's about 1 trillion yen a year,
But do we have the absorptive capacity for that?
In a word, yes. And I think not only can we meet this target, we can also surpass it. There will, of course, remain some challenges in the execution, and I think some of the answers might be in involving more fully the Indian private sector. And I think the understanding at the governmental level, I think if we reach that on the private sector level, I just come back to the point I started with, that we are sort of just scratching the surface, and the future, to my mind, is, just blindingly optimistic and positive.
Okay. Alok, I'll let you have the final word on this panel today as we wind up, and this is to take your thoughts here for the viewers on the digital infrastructure bit. One of the biggest projects that we are now looking at is the open network for, and some call it as a project that is aimed at certain e-commerce players. But leave that aside, what do you really think it is going to lead to?
And just before I get to that answer, see, I firmly believe that the role of technology, or for that matter, foreign infrastructure, should be to make the society more productive today than it was yesterday. And if that infrastructure and if that digital investment is not driving that, then I think that's money getting wasted. I think the digital revolution that is currently happening in the country, there are many things that our citizens are experiencing that they have not experienced the basic, but they have leapfrogged into something else. I'll give you an example. Aadhaar card. It's for many people it may be seen as just a number that goes in your pocket, but for us who have powered the entire Aadhaar card infrastructure, for us it's giving a voice to a citizen. It is now slowly becoming the basis on which your identity, your subsidies, your way of how you are growing and progressing is dependent on. We've just launched a project, in 4 airports where, through a program called DigiYatra, which was in news just about a week back, where your face becomes your identity. You walk into the airport, and based on your facial recognition, you don't have to touch anything. You don't have to go to any counter, no kiosk. You are automatically checked in, and your face becomes the boarding pass to get to the... Now, these are revolutionary experiences that our citizens need to have. Imagine the impact that the airports will have, the amount of traffic and throughput it can handle. And in doing that, the serpentine queues that our citizens are able to avoid, which means, again, going back to the point I was making, we are in a society which is in a hurry, right? So we've got to create infrastructure that answers to that challenge. It is not about just putting a rail track. It is not just about putting bridges. It's about efficiency of throughput. It's about how quickly can we get our citizens to experience what they want to experience, and it is their right. So I think digital will play a massive role in compressing the time that this geography, this country needs to become a superpower. And I was just going to add to that. Somebody in the beginning of the panel, we were talking about how fast are we going to multiply our growth. India reached the first trillion of its GDP in 36 years. The third trillion was reached in 11 years. The fifth trillion is supposed to be reached in 3 years' time. That's the momentum and velocity with which we are moving, right? So I think digital is here to play that role. It can be the magic glue, the super glue that puts it all together. And that is critical in making sure that India truly reaches the place that it deserves to reach.
We've just been given a few more minutes, so I want to take that one last topic that was on my mind throughout this panel. And this is, while we talk about infrastructure, world-class infrastructure, the B2B part of it, there's a consumer part of it which is also important, which is the ability of the Indian user to pay for it. And we have seen that also becoming an issue for many projects. Mangal, I'm starting with you. Is there a sort of question mark over unit economics when it comes to certain kinds of infrastructure, both the physical and the digital in India?
So definitely, the cost of building infrastructure has to be paid by someone. And what I see is that, you talk about transportation, mobility, the interconnectivity, seamless connectivity, multimodal transfer, using digital as the backbone, creating a mobility as a service, I think is an answer which will not only make sure you can seamlessly travel, pay at one point for the entire journey, through the one card, that is being devised for the entire country and is being followed. But also, when you look at the green and environment and, look at the energy consumption, I think one of the biggest sector in the railway will be how to reduce the energy consumption. And if these two things, I think, will make the entire experience more affordable.
More affordable. Bharat, to you, and last to Faisal, of course, on this.
So we work mostly in the B2B space, right? So our freight trains carry finished cars for Maruti Suzuki, for Toyota, which is an affiliate of Mitsui-san in some ways. We carry containers across the country. We also work with NEC on the logistics data bank, which recently crossed some 5 crore, 50 million containers. And yes, I share this concern. I wish our customers would pay us more. But having said that, you have made a good point about unit economics, because the scale of India is possibly unmatched in most sectors. But we are hoping that as we get richer, we see the manifestation in both not just the purchasing power, but also the purchasing willingness. So thanks.
Alok.
Look, the age-old, definition of demand economics. If there is demand, there will be supply, and you will get the price. The question is that, are we crafting the right value proposition that a customer is ready to pay for? This is not a customer's problem. This is our problem. We have to unbundle the challenge of project execution and infrastructure and everything that we talked about. And we have to take it to the lowest common multiple and say, in what shape and form do I deploy the right technology at the right place at the right cost so that they get paid for it? Of course, in doing all of this, we have to take a long-term view. Somebody has to pay for it for a long term so that the gestation period and the payback comes through. But I don't think we should work with a notion where we say that, oh yeah, we are bringing great technology to you, but the customer is not ready to pay. No, I think you just can't cheat and cut and copy and paste, because we are a different country. We are hugely, the span on economic, per capita income is huge in our country. And if you have the right value proposition designed, I think the consumers will pay for it. You have to be able to craft it and articulate it well, both of the jobs that we don't do very well in our country.
Faisal, the last word on the panel today to you.
Yeah, thank you. The short answer, can the consumer pay for high-tech, expensive infrastructure? My view, the short answer is yes. And we can go into all kinds of details as to how do we deploy and how do we create a value proposition that the Indian, whichever segment you look at, the Indian consumer can pay for it. I don't think we have the time, this is the occasion, but I'll just use one example, which is a very recent example, and that's the electrification of mobility, right? There was a traditional view as recently as 3 years ago that lithium-ion batteries or electric mobility in India is down the line. But what is the reality? And that argument was based on the fact that you first need to invest in charging infrastructure, and then the transition from internal combustion engines to electric mobility will happen. But if you look at two-wheelers and three-wheelers, the use case of use by day and charge by night is in place. And we make batteries, we make lithium-ion batteries in India. So I'm coming to you from on the ground. We can't meet the demand. Wow. Electric two-wheelers, electric three-wheelers, the poorest of the poor, they are able to afford it. And today, perhaps for the first time in 35 years, people here were probably as old as me will remember that we used to have a waiting list for buying scooters, two-wheelers in the mid-80s. Today there's a waiting list for electric vehicles. People are waiting to buy electric two-wheelers and electric three-wheelers, so consumers can pay for it.
I'm glad that I came to Faisal last because he gave us a wonderfully appropriate example of what the future really means and how policy and private sector capability needs to come together. Thanks to the entire panel for their wonderful views, and a round of applause for all of you. Thank you very much.